Rave to the Grave.
Welcome to Rave to the Grave. As a young photographer for The Village Voice, Bill Bernstein was assigned to shoot a celebrity event at New York's infamous Studio 54. This night would change the trajectory of his life forever. Bernstein became obsessed with documenting the fabulous people of New York City nightlife in the late 1970s, shooting at clubs like Xenon, Hurrah, Gigis Barnum Room, and the Paradise Garage. In the process, he created some of the most iconic images of the disco era, an electrifying time when the energy of the civil rights movement and the broken-down city was amplified by this pounding new music, dance, and wild self-expression. In 2018, after nearly a 40-year hiatus from nightclubs, another chance event drew Bill back to shooting NYC's gender-fluid nightlife scene, this time in Brooklyn. In this episode, I talked to Bill about what he experienced in those legendary clubs, photography as anthropology, and how the reverberations of the disco underground can still be felt in the mainstream today. Welcome to Rave to the Grave. Bill, welcome to Rave to the Grave.
Well, thank you, Vivian. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you. So tell me about the first ever time that you set foot in a nightclub.
Let's see. Well, what comes to mind really is the first night that I did it as a professional photographer. I was just starting my career at the Village Voice in the late 70s. I had just gotten out of college and was floundering around a little bit, doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Not really quite sure what I wanted to do. I always loved photography. So I got my first assignment from the Village Voice. I walked in one day to show the art director my portfolio of pictures that I had just kind of taken on the side of friends and, people around different neighborhoods. Robert Christow, I think it was, came running in and said, it was either, or Richard Goldstein, and said, we don't have a photographer for tonight to photograph Carlos Santana at Roseland. What are we going to do? And the art director, George Delmerico, looked at me and he said, well, I don't see why Bill Bernstein can't do this. So I got my first job. It was a little bit like A Star is Born, because it was pretty much the first time I ever showed my work to an art director in my life. And that night I had an assignment to shoot Carlos Santana, who I was a big fan of, by the way, and at Roseland. And I remember going back to my apartment and calling a friend who was a photographer and saying, what do I need? What do I bring with me tonight? And I had, I think, one or two lenses and a flash. And he lent me another lens, a long lens, so I could shoot from the audience and do some telephoto stuff. But that night I ended up downstairs in Carlos Santana's dressing room. And it was just me and Carlos Santana. And I knocked on the door. And the manager said, he's in there. And I said, well, can I go in there? And he said, yeah, just knock on the door. So I knocked on the door and I kind of peeked my head in. And he was just sitting on the floor with his guitar and his amplifier. And there was a desk with some candles burning and a picture of his guru. And he was just kind of sitting on the floor and he was playing. He was warming up. He was getting his head together. And I said, I'm with the Village Voice. And he said, come on in. So I came in and I kind of crept over to the corner and sat down. And he just played. He just had his eyes closed and he just played. And it was just by himself, And I sat there taking pictures of this moment in front of me. And I just felt like there was a voice in my head that just said, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Whatever this is. And then years later, I got to do that with Paul McCartney, where he invited me to be his tour photographer. And it was pretty much the same thing. I became just an extension of, his environment. And he would go take a phone call. He would go to a meeting. He would do some rehearsal. He would go into a studio. He got married, all kinds of things. And I was just there, and that was an honor, because I was the world's biggest Beatle fan when I was a young guy. So to be with this guy was just amazing to me.
Okay, take us back. So you begin shooting for the Village Voice, which is, I should mention, a free paper as well. So
Yeah.
for years in New York, you could just pick it up or somebody would leave it on the train and you'd read it. So actually a ton of people would see your work. So you're shooting for the Village Voice. Tell me about the experience that led you into this nightlife as a photographer.
I was given an assignment one night to go to Studio 54 in 1977. And it opened up, I believe, sometime like in the middle of 1977. It opened its doors and became an immediate, like overnight place that had a huge reputation. So there was an event there that night with Lillian Carter, who was President Carter's mother. And she had done some work for a charity in India. So they had a big black tie event and a lot of celebrities were there. And they gave her some awards and there was a fashion show. The picture that I got that night was basically her sitting at the table with talking to Andy Warhol. That was the big picture. But I had never been able to get into Studio 54. I tried a couple of times. I stood in line outside with my hand waved and for an hour or so, and I could never get in. It was very, very hard to get into. That was kind of one of the things that was so interesting about the place, because before then there wasn't really the velvet rope and the line outside in many places that I can remember. So after the event was over, I decided that I wanted to hang out and see what like a regular night at Studio 54 was like, because I thought I'll probably never be able to get back in here again. And so I remember I bought some film from a photographer who was leaving and hung out in the balcony for about an hour, like hiding out in the shadows so they didn't find me and throw me out. And then I just waited around and the crowd started to come in, the regulars started to come in, and I stayed there like for hours and hours, just fascinated by what I saw. You know, what I saw was very visually interesting. As a photographer, just starting out and looking for something to photograph, you know, like a personal project, I thought, what I'm looking at, what I'm seeing right in front of my eyes is very visual and it's really interesting. It was a mixture of cultures, like marginalized cultures, subcultures, mainstream cultures. There was everything from, you know, what they would call transvestites back then, which are now, you know, trans men and women, pre-op, post-op transgender. There was the whole LGBT spectrum on the dance floor, along with kind of, you know, a suit and tie crowd, an upscale white crowd with an African-American crowd with, you know, Latin. It was just an amazing mix of people that I had never seen before, like under one roof. It was that mix that really captured my imagination back then. I must say, the music, some of it was good, some of it I really liked, but that wasn't really where my head was at. And there were celebrities at Studio 54, but that wasn't really where my head was at either, actually. My head was really into this cultural mix as a photographer who's really probably an anthropologist at heart.
So what was going on in New York in the 1970s or like 1977? Where were you living? What kind of life were you leading? And what would have been like in the sort of streets, or what were people concerned about at that point of time?
New York City was in default. New York City was about to go bankrupt. New York City looked very different than it does today. Although I must say, with COVID happening right now, I go into the city. I live in Brooklyn, but I go into the city and I do see remnants of what it kind of looked like back then. Sometimes when I walk around Midtown and I see boarded up buildings, I see windows that have been smashed. It's reminiscent of like the 70s in New York City. There was no money. It was fires would start and there wouldn't be enough firemen and they would just let the building burn down. There were garbage strikes all the time. So garbage would pile up outside buildings for weeks. There would be subway strikes. That was when graffiti was all over the place in subways. It was really a different city than it is today, or certainly like before COVID, where the East Village is so gentrified. You didn't really want to go to certain parts of the East Village back then. You were scared to go back then. You were scared. Parts of Brooklyn you were scared to go to. Parts of, I lived in Soho at that time when it just became Soho. And there was no Tribeca. Tribeca didn't really even exist. The Upper East Side was kind of always sort of a ritzy place to be, an upscale kind of place to be. But it was really, it was a different place. It was full of creative talent. It was inexpensive, so you could have a loft. You could have a big apartment, or, for $90. I think that was my rent back then, $90 in Soho. So I could live on being a freelancer at the Village Voice, where I think I got $50 a picture. So if I did 2 pictures a month, I could pay my rent.
Wow. The dream.
The economics were really different back then. It was like one of the most creative periods, I think, in terms of like having great artists living there all at the same time, just beginning in its history.
I think that's one of the things that makes photographs of that time so compelling and people constantly returning to them over and over, is that you obviously had so many people trying out different things, trying out different looks, trying on different identities. Times like that are ephemeral. So there's something like magical about it that even looking at a photo of it today, it still has the sort of essence or the magic of that time.
Yeah.
You go to Studio 54, you're there till 6 a.m, you're seeing all these wild people. You kind of just like get sort of bitten with this idea that you want to photograph nightclubs. Where do you go from there?
Yeah, the nightclub scene itself was, I was not that into that scene at the time. And that was right after, Saturday Night Fever. So, that's how I heard about the nightclub scene, and that's what I kind of understood about it. That was in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, so it was a little bit different in terms of like, that wasn't particularly an inclusive club. Yeah, so what did I do? So I started to talk to people about like, hey, what's going on? What other than Studio 54? What's going on? I knew about CBGB's, which wasn't a nightclub, it was more of a performance place. I knew about Max's Kansas City, but then I found out about places like Xenon. It was an old theater. They converted it into a disco, and it had the same kind of feeling as Studio 54, where backdrops would lower during the evening, and they had these special sets designed with lights, and they had smoke machines, and it was really like theatrical. During the course of the evening, like the whole room would sort of change with a new set, and you'd be dancing, and all of a sudden you'd realize you were almost in a different place. But then I was also interested in places like Paradise Garage, which was down on King Street. It wasn't like theatrical in the same sense as Xenon and Studio 54, but it was basically a parking garage that was converted into a disco. And it had a big disco ball and an amazing sound system. And the state-of-the-art sound system in those days was created by Richard Long. The DJ at Paradise Garage was Larry Levan. And he's considered to be one of the really kind of legendary figures from that era. He had such a great connection with the audience, I think. I think that was what made him so special. People used to go there and they get there at 11 or 12 at night and leave at like, 2 the next afternoon or whatever. I mean, it wasn't, celebrities would go there. Grace Jones went there. Keith Haring had his birthday party there, but that wasn't what it was about. It was primarily like Larry's crowd. And these people used to call it like Sunday Mass. It was pure sweat and dancing. And they didn't have an alcohol license, so people used to bring their own whatever they wanted to bring. Mostly, it was in those days, it was poppers, which is amyl nitrate, which gave you an amazing rush. And you could you walked into these places and you always smelled that smell of poppers along with pot, and whatever else basically kept you going through the night. I mean, it was like definitely you wanted to do something that gave you a rush because you wanted to keep dancing all night. You wanted to stay up. So there was that scene, which I loved. And I got to hang out a little bit with Larry and photograph him. I think one of the things that made him great was the fact that he played what he wanted to play in the moment. And he had this great sensitivity to what the vibe of the room was, and what people wanted to hear. And he also played what he wanted to play. So it was a mix of many different kinds of music. You'd hear R&B, you'd hear a little like rock and roll, you'd hear pretty much anything that he liked, So people were always surprised by what he played, and it was always the right thing at the right time. And I wasn't there that night, but I heard that one night he loved the song Love is a Battlefield. He played it like 15 times in a row. And so that's kind of Larry. I mean, that's what he felt like doing, and the audience was all over it. They loved it, There was another club called Gigis Barnum Room, which I loved, which had a history. It started out as the Peppermint Lounge back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, which is where the Twist started, Chubby Checker and the Twist. After it was the Peppermint Lounge, it became something else, which was primarily a gay bar, I think. And then it became Gigi's Barnum Room. And they put this gigantic net over the dance floor and trapezes and bars, to swing from above it. And they would have disco bats, who were pretty good acrobats, actually, and they would perform during the evening. So it had a real circus feeling to it. And it was fairly big, so it had lots of little rooms that you could go into. And basically the main crowd were transgender men and women. And it was kind of their place, and you would go there, but you were like a visitor, you were a guest in their place. They really, that was their place. They owned it, Once you set foot outside of that place, most of those people risked their lives just walking down the street in New York in 1979. As liberal and as inclusive as New York City is and was, homophobia was still pretty rampant back then, So they risked their lives really daily, living the lives that being the people who they wanted to be, who they felt inside that they really were. And they could walk into this club and just be at home, and it wasn't hidden out in some corner in, the meatpacking district, and it was a popular club. So I like the openness of all of that and the inclusiveness of all of that. And it kind of became a little bit of a place to go if you were in from out of town, like on business. If you're from like Columbus, Ohio, and you're in town for your like concrete mixers, convention.
That must have made for some ridiculous conversations.
You would go there and just look at the scene. The vibe was so good in these places, which is something that I never, in the years that I shot at all of these places, I never saw a fight. I never saw an argument. I never felt any bad vibes. Let's put it that way. I never saw, you would see people get drunk once in a while, but they would just sort of like, someone would put them on a chair or a couch or lay them on the floor or something. But I never, there was never bad vibes. It was just always really good vibes the whole time. And that's something in itself.
I want to talk about some of these other night spots too, because one of the interesting things to me is that you have in your pictures a lot of photos of places that are less known. I wanted to ask you about Harrah's and Mud Club, because you really were following these sort of different tribes of people that would go to different night spots. I mean, it wasn't the same type of people in each place, right?
I would say during that time period, there were several clubs called, I guess you'd call them almost like punk or new wave. New wave was just kind of coming into its own. But the two clubs that I followed with my camera were the Mud Club and Hurrah. The dress and the movement, the pose, was different than, say, Studio 54. It was punker. It was downtown art crowd. It was disco sucks crowd. There was an anti-establishment feeling to it. But it was a good scene. It was cool. Amphetamines were big there. You'd also get like 2-and-alls and second-alls, so people could really like chill out. Those are like sleeping pills, very strong, sedative sleeping pills. And they were downers, and it slowed everything down. And so I basically stayed pretty straight when I was at these clubs. I never did any drugs or drank anything when I was shooting, because it was hard enough to shoot at these clubs as it was, because I was shooting with Tri-X film, the highest speed black and white film of its day, basically, which means that you could shoot it in low light and you could get something on the film, and I had my flash. But, I was shooting in clubs that had like strobe lights going on. And so for a second it was bright, and then for the next second it was dark. They didn't have autofocus back then, so you had to focus, and focusing was tough, and getting the right expression was tough, and getting the right, just getting the right moment was hard enough. So I could never have done any drugs and shot at the same time. And then even then, you're lucky when you got something. I'd say generally I would shoot somewhere between 5 and 10 rolls a night, 36 pictures. And that was a lot back then, But if I were shooting today, I would shoot probably twice that many, just because, I had to pay for all that film back then. Each roll was like $5, and then it had to be processed and all that kind of stuff. So it was a whole different economic system. And also you didn't know if you were in some weird lighting situation, you didn't know when you were shooting it if you were really getting it or not. Whereas today you could just look at the back of your camera and say, oh, wow, I need to stop down, or I need to, change my ISO or whatever. You knew that immediately. Back then you were really going on like experience, well, I remember, 2 nights ago, I had something like this, and I needed to be at like F8 and a 60th of a second, It was much more difficult back then. But as a photographer, I'm glad I went through that, because I understand all that now.
What are some essential tips for people who want to be nightlife photographers?
I'd say, the first thing is like, you've got to see the right thing in front of you. I mean, like, make sure you got something really interesting going on in front of you. And if you can, try to sort of understand what it is you're seeing that's capturing your attention. Whether it's the pose of the person, or the action of the person, or the background, or the clothing, or whatever it is, like, just sort of focus in on that with your picture. So the picture becomes about what's important. Okay. And this applies pretty much to photography in general, I think, So you're not just taking a scene with like, see that, look in there. That's really interesting there. It's like, focus in on what's caught your attention, what you're trying to show people. And when I'm shooting, I like to balance, if I'm using a flash, I like to balance the flash with the available light. So it's not as hard a looking flash. And so in order to do that, you have to have your shutter speed. It has to stay open for a certain period of time, whether it's a 30th of a second or even a 15th of a second, so that you're letting in the available light as well. And you can turn the flash down a little bit so it's not overpowering the scene. So you get this nice blending of the available light and your flash.
Who are some of the people that you remember from that time that you love to shoot, or people that you just were kind of these fabulous or weird characters or wild characters that that kind of stand out to you?
I guess, I love some of the really out there characters, like Rollerina was one of them, who was at Studio 54 a lot, was at Xenon a lot, was also kind of a fixture in the West Village. And she, who was male by day, I guess, and was supposedly like a banker or in the Wall Street world, and lived in the West Village, and at night would walk around in like a bridal wedding gown with a crown and a wand. And I remember she wore a button that said, "How dare you presume I'm heterosexual?"
And roller skates? Is that part of this?
Yes. That was what part I forgot. And roller skates. And that was why they called her Rollerina. And she would roll around and bless you, bless you, child, and, tap you with her wand. It was interesting to photograph Steve Rebell, who is the co-owner of Studio 54. When I first met him, when I first got there that first night, I remember he was in black tie, and he was very friendly, very excited about the evening, and, asked me about my life working for the Village Voice, and was very curious about it. And as time went on and years went on, he just got more and more like into drugs, I think, because he didn't really, after a while, he didn't remember who I was. He'd say, "Who are you again?" And he was used to get pretty high most nights, So that I was kind of witnessing like the fall of this guy as he got more and more famous and rich. Other characters, like again, Gigis Barnum Room, were some of my favorite people. Talking to this one pre-op transgender named Ava, who was this beautiful woman from Puerto Rico who was saving up for an operation, and was also very good friends with Salvador Dali. And Salvador Dali would invite her to come to dinner when he was in town with his friends, and he would try to set her up with one of his friends as a sort of surreal joke, and they would end up back at the hotel room or whatever, the friend and Ava, and then the friend would discover that Ava was not totally a female. And I remember her telling me that, and I said, "Well, were you okay with that?" Because that sounded like it could end up being sort of a dangerous encounter, And she said it never turned out that way, and that she loved Dali, and he was an amazing man. She had nothing bad to say about him. One of the first pictures I took was a picture that was used on the cover of my book of this couple that were in tuxedo, and the woman has a cigarette holder, and the guy has a black eye, and they're like a couple, And I asked them if I could photograph them, and I shot like one or two pictures of them, and they ended up becoming like my muse for the whole time I was shooting, because there was something about them that reminded me of like the movie Cabaret, and the whole that whole period, that whole pre-war Berlin, Germany, freedom of expression, the Weimar Republic, and that movie, Cabaret. And I just started to look around and see that vibe all around me. It was set against the backdrop of like a city that's kind of like almost in ruins, like this is what's happening in the dead of night, So that, I don't know, that was pretty impactful. Again, they were regular people, that I was interested in. I didn't really hang out with the celebrities. I wasn't really interested in that.
But I mean, I feel like somebody like a member of the Disco Bats or Kid Creole or, or Rollerina is like way more interesting than a celebrity. And
Right.
is a celebrity of sorts in their own, universe and in the nightlife universe.
Totally. Yeah, I had no interest in celebrities from the very first night that I was there. And I kind of remember myself sitting in the darkness and saying, this is really what I'm interested in, the real crowd. I'm interested in who are these people? They come out at night and they're decked out and they're living a fantasy life at this place. And to them, they were celebrities. They themselves were the celebrities, and they were hanging out with celebrities, but they were celebrities for that night. I mean, during the day, I don't know. They worked in stores, or they were, they were waitresses or waiters or whatever they did. But at night, they were celebrities, and people weren't really passive at most places. I mean, they went there to be part of some scene and to be part of some, as you say, tribe. So they weren't just going there to look at other people. They were going there to be seen and to be part of it and to be part of the scene. Somehow I think it's a little different from the clubs that I've gone to today, where people either go to dance or just hang out with their friends. And it's not so much of a scene. You have a place like House of Yes, which I've been to, and they they try to recreate a scene, with the performance artists that are there, and that's kind of interesting. And it rings a little bit. It sort of harkens back to Studio 54, where they would have people perform or pay people to go out and do stuff and loosen people up, or theme nights. But for some reason, as good as it is, it never really captured the moment that I saw back in like the late 70s. And I don't know why that is. Part of it could be me, that I'm older. But for some reason, that magic that I felt back then is different than it is today.
I think also back then you had a lot more, I mean, even up until the early 2000s, you had a lot more regulars at clubs. Like if you talk to the people who went to the Paradise Garage, they were going there every week for years on end, a lot of them. So it was a family and it was like a participatory thing. And there's still kind of a family today in a lot of ways. Like they'll go to the reunion party of that. And I think that exists a little bit less now, partially because of the way that clubs operate, like just the nuts and bolts of how they book DJs and not having regular nights so much anymore. But it feels to me like people are less participatory. There's less of an idea that you need to actually be involved and participating when you go to the club, and more of like, I can stand here on my phone. This level of remove from the action. But if you get too many people doing that, then it's not as fun, obviously.
Yeah. A lot of people go there with a few friends and they hang with their friends, and a lot of them have things to do or watch, and they want to be it's almost like they want to be entertained, and it's a show that's being put on for them. Whereas my sense with a lot of the stuff that was going on when I was shooting was like everyone who went there wanted to be part of the show. If you look at the time period back then, it was a very interesting period. It was the late 70s. So you had it was between Stonewall and AIDS, basically. And Stonewall was like the final straw that broke the camel's back with the LGBT movement, where it's like, we're not going to take this shit anymore. And there was also like the women's movement back then in the 60s and 70s, breaking the glass ceiling kind of thing. There was the civil rights movement. There's a lot of movement and movements within the culture, the American culture at that time. A lot of things, a lot of marginalized cultures and subcultures were gaining a voice, during that time period. And when disco happened, the way I saw it was it happened in it sort of became visible to the mainstream culture in mid 70s. And it was like a place for all of these movements that were attaining their voice to go and celebrate, and express their individuality and, their freedom. And So I see this like going under a big tent and everyone's under there. And the music itself was like celebration. It was like dance music. It was get off your ass and dance and party, whereas rock and roll was like, either rebel against something or get stoned and listen to this, or it's political, or just, it was just, it was different. It wasn't necessarily all get up and, dance and forget about shit for the night, and that's what disco was in a lot of ways. It was really party music. It was a way for these cultures to celebrate. And that's what I was feeling back then. There was a party going on. It was like a perfect storm.
So we kind of touched on it before, but disco was gaining this mainstream momentum. Like you had Saturday Night Fever, and you had discos in kind of suburban areas that were probably a far cry in some ways from an underground club playing disco in New York. Not only like would the patrons be completely different, but like the whole scene and maybe even the records played would be different. But do you think that regardless of that disco blowing up in the mainstream changed anything about mainstream culture or ideology? Like I listened back to the famous disco songs that would have been on the radio, and there are so many messages in there about being gay and being out and being proud, and at a time in culture that was very homophobic.
That's a good question. I think it put the spotlight on it so that even if you were living in Dubuque or whatever, you knew that this was happening. It's shown a light on the fact that this was going on. There were people out there who were different than you. I mean, it also, like, you have Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive, which is a real, like, I see that as more of a women's liberation song, but it's also could be a gay liberation song. For the most part, I'd say it was just a positive message about the mix, about how people can mix as different cultures. And I think that's probably what echoed out over our American culture. Also, when Saturday Night Fever came out, the Bee Gees did the soundtrack, and that's a white rock and roll band. Saturday Night Fever really brought it from like David Mancuso's loft parties, in Manhattan, which were underground and mostly gay. Ice Palace was out in Fire Island, which was like mostly gay. But Saturday Night Fever was Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, which is a very white part of town, probably very homophobic, very working class, and that's what people saw. And that's, I think, to many people, that was their first introduction to disco. And that's what actually a lot of discos outside of Manhattan were like. When I was shooting, I also went out to New Jersey there's places that like the Strawberry Patch and places out in Long Island. And they were more Saturday Night Fever modeled. So New York City is a bubble onto itself, and it still is, and it probably always will be to some extent. When I did the book got published called Disco: The Bill Bernstein Photographs in 2015, and which is a long way from 1979. And the publisher asked me to write a foreword to the book, and I didn't really know what to say in my foreword. And this was 2000, I guess it was 2000, the end of 2014. And as I was spending time trying to figure out what to say in my foreword, a couple of things happened in America. And one was that they allowed transgender men and women to be accepted into the military. And I was like, wow, okay, that's pretty big. The other thing was the Equal Marriage Amendment got passed by the Supreme Court. So it was a nationally mandated law that no matter what state you were in, you could, if you were same sex, you could get married under the Constitution, under the Supreme Court law. I was like, that's pretty amazing. And then there was a lot of stuff going on with removing the Confederate flag from southern states, outside capitals of southern states. So I started to think to myself, well, like, wow, that's really amazing that there's this really is a sea change happening in our mainstream culture today. It was all like within a 6-month period. And so it really felt like, wow, there's a shift. There's a major shift going on. And that's kind of like what I saw back when I was shooting in like the late 70s. That mixture of, all of these different cultures and the acceptance and the inclusion. That's what I saw. And so that was kind of what my forward was about. After the 70s, it kind of went away for a while, all that inclusion. AIDS happened, and that was very devastating, especially to the gay culture, because you didn't know how it was transmitted. If you're talking to somebody and they touch you or they sweat on you or something, is that going to transmit AIDS? There was very little known about it. There was a disco demolition night in Chicago, which was like kind of a backlash against disco music. And also Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. And for the first 2 years, he didn't even want to say the word AIDS, very conservative president. So there was a very conservative backlash culturally after the 70s, It was like a big party in the 70s that all of a sudden like got closed down. There's also like Studio 54 was closed down, or it was closed down, but it kept going. But Steve Rebell and Ian Schrager were sent to jail for tax evasion. Steve Rebell said one night, when he was completely stoned and being interviewed by the press, that if the IRS knew how much money Studio 54 was really making, they'd come in here and close us down, and that was published in the newspaper. And I think a couple of months later, they were closed. The IRS did come and close them down.
Don't give interviews while high.
Exactly. We won't do that again. Yeah. So there was that. And then, the disco demolition, which is really, that was in Chicago. And that was like, basically people wanted their white rock and roll music back again. A certain sector of the population had sort of had it with disco music. If you think about it, who were the reigning stars of disco music? It's like Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor, black females. That was unheard of, in the rock and roll world. And so there was a racist component to the whole anti-disco movement. In my opinion, like I say, disco died, like in 1979, 1980. But a lot of people would totally disagree with me and say, you're crazy. Disco lived on, it's like still going on today, And I don't mean that the music necessarily died or the spirit died, because there were a lot of great clubs in the 80s. There was a Limelight here in New York. I mean, Grace Jones was huge, and Paradise Garage was still going on. Studio 54 was still going on. But there was something that changed, in the scene. So I felt that happening. And I also felt like I was sort of personally like done with what I had to say about that time period. And I sort of felt it kind of changing. And I felt like as a photographer and an artist, it was time for me to sort of move on. I segued out probably about 1980. I started actually towards the end going around to discos with a friend who was a writer. And she would interview people while I would shoot. And so when we finished that, we actually we tried to get a book published at that point. And so we brought it around to a number of publishers, and Random House decided that they liked it as an idea. And so they have a paperback division, or had, called Ballantine Books. And we were assigned to this young editor who was really into the project and loved what we were doing. And it was really before disco really, really ended, before disco really was dead, quote unquote. So they put out this book. It was called Night Dancin', Ballantine Books. And by the time it got like designed and printed and distributed, like disco had really like become a dirty word. And I think it sold like a few hundred copies and then went to the remainder rack. I got a call in like 2002 from a music producer in London, David Hill is his name, who asked me if I was the same Bill Bernstein that did Night Dancing. And I said, yes. And he said, well, there's some amazing photographs in here and it should be a coffee table book. He basically found a publisher in London and it became the coffee table book that it became. But that's when I started shooting at discos when that book was published, because I also felt like that was sort of like the period at the end of that sentence. Then after that, like in the 80s, I kind of went into more portraiture and shooting all kinds of people for all different purposes. And then towards the end of the 80s, I started teaming up. I got hooked up with Paul McCartney and started going out on tour with him as his tour photographer, which was sort of reminiscent of the work I was doing at the discos. You know, it was documentary work, but the culture I was following was the culture of Paul McCartney.
I want to talk a bit about your current work or the work that you were doing before the pandemic hit, shooting in Brooklyn nightlife. Can you tell me a little bit about what drew you back to maybe not nightclubs, but the people of nightclubs, and what drew you back to shooting this world after so long being away from it?
Well, I had an exhibit at the Museum of Sex in New York City about like nightclubs from the 70s. And there were about, 40 images from that era that were blown up. And they created this room that was kind of like a disco from that era. It was there for about 2 years. You know, it was supposed to be there for a couple of months. And it was just, people dug it. And they also ended up having parties there. And the environment was very cool. And there were times when I would go there during the night when I would just feel this energy in the room that really felt very reminiscent of that era in the 70s. Again, there was a mixture of various subculture, and I saw a lot of like gender fluidity, non-binary culture. And I was interested in that. It also seemed to be an extension of what I was interested in back in the 70s. There was this freedom of expression. And so after a while, I asked Dan Gluck, who's the director of the museum, if I could set up like a little studio on the floor above where the exhibit was and the parties were, and bring a backdrop and lighting and stuff, and shoot some of the people that came to these parties. And he thought, oh, that's a great idea. Yeah, definitely. So I ended up doing that for like, I guess I shot there maybe 4 or 5 nights. This was started around 2018. I actually got to spend some time photographing them and talking to them. And I would also get their contact information and interview some of them on the phone or in person afterwards. And just to find out, like, what's your life about? What's, how do you feel about certain things? Just what's your life like? Just very curious, open-ended questions. Then the Museum of Sex exhibit closed down, and I was left trying to figure out, well, what do I do now? And then I found out that there were some clubs in Brooklyn specifically that were doing interesting things. The Good Room was one of them. I also went to House of Yes, which was interesting. And I went to $3 Bill also. And then COVID hit. And then I had to stop. So I'm kind of like in the middle of that project right now. There's a gallery in Florida in Palm Beach that I showed it to recently. And they expressed an interest in the project. And there's also a gallery in Prague that's interested in this project as well. And I see it as kind of a multimedia thing where interviews along with photographs, so that as you experience looking at these people, you're also hearing their own voice and talking about their lives.
Was there anything else interesting that you found out when you were interviewing these subjects? I mean, this is like many generations removed. So I assume this generation has like a different outlook, but there's probably some commonalities too between what people are saying when you're interviewing them.
One thing that I just noticed is that I won't say mainstream, but how commonly accepted all of this is, at least in New York. I can only really speak for New York City.
You mean gender fluidity or fluid
fluidity.
sexuality?
Yeah. Yeah. How mainstream it is, at least again in New York. And like really you go outside of New York and it's a different world. Because a lot of the people that I interviewed, that one guy was from Poughkeepsie, New York, which is upstate, like an hour and a half or so. And he said, I said, can you walk around Poughkeepsie, where you're from with your family, dressed like this? And he goes, not really, but he walks around the city that way, and his friends are dressed that way. And, and it's just it's just part of the culture, part of the younger culture, and mostly I would say like the teens and 20-year-olds, I would ask them what pronoun they wanted to go by. And most of the younger 20-year-olds, millennials, whatever, had a pronoun like their and they. Whereas when you got into the 30s and 40s, it was like the gay men were like he, and him. So it's the whole pronoun thing to me seems like a younger generation thing. But that's how things change, generations come up with a slight shift in angle. And then that puts the whole trajectory off. And then the next generation comes and it's another angle. And, and before you know it, it's all a totally different thing. But it takes generations to do that. It doesn't happen within a generation, But so here I am like 3 or 4 generations later from the group that I was shooting in the 70s. And it's much more mainstream. It's much more normalized, Like back then there was no Caitlyn Jenner, that no matter where you live in the world, that there's a Caitlyn Jenner. And that's what, regardless of what your reaction is or what your cultural conditioning is to that concept, it's out there in the world and it's a part of the world. Whereas back in the 70s, that didn't exist. It existed at, dark underground places, clubs that didn't have names, that, you were dark and, got raided.
Yeah, there wasn't much mainstream representation of the gay community or any kind of LGBT thing, or even you were talking about the 70s being the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement. There was so much less representation of diversity in the media and like diverse lifestyles in the media than there is today. But I think it's interesting because nightclubs and like the underground is where you'll kind of see these ideas that people are exploring and are free to explore in some sort of underground scene that will later like get in the mainstream, maybe in a little bit of a different way or maybe like modified slightly, but like that's where these ideas incubate that eventually are part of the popular culture. Exactly.
I mean, that's where it starts, in these clubs in Brooklyn, in Manhattan. I'm sure they're all over the country or not all over the world, but they're much more visible for some reason in New York City. I would say then maybe San Francisco has its own version of it, but New York City is just like the melting pot still. Yeah.
What's your guess as to what is going to happen after the pandemic is over, after COVID? What's going to happen in the nightlife? Like, are you looking forward to getting back to this work?
I am. I really am. And I think it's going to come back. I really do. And, like I was saying before, how New York City reminds me of the 70s a little bit, People are moving out of New York City. People are, rents are cheaper. I mean, they're still not cheap, but it's not like back in the 70s, but rents are going down. And that will attract people here. Spaces are becoming available, like commercial spaces are becoming available for less money. So if somebody has an idea to open up a club somewhere, it's more feasible to do it. As soon as herd immunity kicks in, I think people are going to be dying to get out and party and once they feel safe, which could take a while. I think there'll be a lot of new clubs forming. There'll be a lot of new energy in New York City. I think it's going to be pretty amazing. That's what I predict.
Yeah, I think people are going to be going absolutely wild after being cooped up in the house this whole time. I understand that you do sell prints of your work now online. Where can people find more of these photos that we're talking about?
Yeah, when the COVID thing happened, I kind of decided that I would pivot a little bit and create an e-commerce site because people have always wanted to buy my prints, and I've had gallery shows in the past, so I have some limited edition prints. And so I set up an e-commerce site, and it's billbernsteinfineart.com. And if they go there, they can see the ones that I'm selling online. I also have a gallery exhibit coming up in February in Palm Beach at a gallery down there, which will have very limited editions, things that have not been seen yet, and much larger scales for much more like serious collectors. And then also possibly Prague. There's discussion of having that exhibit at a gallery in Prague sometime this year. But Bill Bernstein Fine Art would be the place to go.
Sounds good. Well, Bill, thank you so much for joining me here on Rave to the Grave. And maybe we'll see you lurking in the corner of a Brooklyn nightclub once this is all over.
Yeah, I'll look for you. And if I see you, I'm going to pull you over to my backdrop of my lighting.
Uh-oh. I'm going to practice my poses at home till we get there. Rave to the Grave is recorded at the historic Newsstand Studios at Rockefeller Center in New York City. The show is hosted and produced by me, Vivian Host. Our engineer is superstar Joe Hazen. Our theme song, and all additional music in this episode, is by Star Eyes. You can listen to Rave to the Grave on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on this and other episodes, check us out on the web at ravetothegrave.org. or follow us on Instagram at ravetothe.grave. Until next time, permission to party.